Hello, my little baby legumes. It's Carla, and I am here today in my kitchen making for you and also for me a personal pot of beans and greens. Beans and greens is my comfort food. You don't have to be making a giant pot of pasta fazool. You can make a personal pot of beans and greens that will be so much more enriching and satisfying than a personal pan pizza, but equally delightful. And the reason that I came up with the recipe for the personal pot of beans and greens is because last winter, I found myself spending more time than usual alone. We've had some familial and personal shifts. So for a time during this transition of coupled to uncoupled, I was spending a week at a time in an apartment by myself. And in the course of doing this, I had a lot of days and nights on my own. It was a really hard time, but it was also a time of enormous personal growth. And with the personal pot of beans and greens, there's a lot of sweetness, a lot of melancholy, a lot of memory, a lot of nostalgia, and all of that can just get all mixed up and be beautiful in its own right. Sometimes when I was solo bolo, I needed to do something to pass the time. And if I didn't know what to do and it was cold outside and I didn't have a social plan, for me, that's a great time to just put something on the stove and take care of it for the day. It makes me feel like I'm doing something productive that also has the sweetest possible outcome because it's gonna turn into a meal. It is something for you to take care of during the day, and then it will take care of you. So this whole dish is really inspired by Carla taking care of Carla. So we're gonna take really nice care of ourselves with delicious, nourishing, enriching foods that are fun to make, that are fun to eat, that are good for us, that make our house smell good, that are not a big deal and not complicated. The other thing that is great about the personal pot is that it's a little bit more than you might eat in one sitting. So then you've made yourself lunch for tomorrow. I am not slicing my garlic. I just smashed it. This is one of those things that it's kind of funny to even have a recipe for it. So you can just get the vibe of what I'm doing, and then you can do your own thing. I'm gonna do some things today that suit me. I'm gonna put spices into my personal pot of beans and greens that are ones that I like. So that's the thing about the personal beans and greens. You make it for you, to suit you, and to please you. And if any of you have gone through a transitional moment in your life when you went from living with a few people to living with only you people, drop us a cheery little red balloon in the comments so we know that being a single balloon can be full of buoyancy and lightness and a celebration of its own. So a lot of this dish is based on instinct. So things like seasoning your onion and your garlic, that's just pretty obvious. Smashing the garlic instead of slicing it, that's a personal choice. So much of my cooking, I feel starts with grabbing the olive oil bottle, pouring it into a pan, throwing in some aromatics, and not even really knowing anything that's gonna come after that. Just the action of picking up the olive oil bottle and doing this is the setting off of something good is gonna happen. So it already smells really amazing and it looks great. And at this point, while this is happening, you can decide what spices you wanna put into your beans and greens. I made this the other day just so I could get down some of the measurements and the timing. And I made a personal pot of beans and greens that was inedible at the end. That's not gonna happen today. I know why it happened. I added a charred onion, which I don't normally do. I added fresh tomato, which I don't normally do. And there was a bitterness that just would not go away. I like coriander and fennel. This could just as easily be anise seed, and cumin is delicious in beans. You could put anise and cumin. You could put dried spices like smoked paprika and oregano. Also delicious. You could have fresh oregano laying around. You could put no spices at all and just really lean into salt, pepper, and some chili flake, and it's gonna be delicious. The thing is, for me, like, the reason why I cook is because I really enjoy cooking. And it is one of the great immersive activities. So if you're sick of being where you are, you could like go somewhere else for a little while, and just going through it, you're gonna feel different at the end. It's a little bit like jumping in the ocean with less shock to the body. It's super witchy. I mean, because there is a lot of magic going on, and like alchemy and like chemical things and things that we don't understand, and things are going into the pot that don't come out of the pot. Things evaporate, they go into the ether. I mean, like a lot of stuff is happening. And so we could get a sense of like why something tastes good or not, but not fully understand it. I don't fully understand this. I just know that if I go slow with the onion and the garlic and maybe put the lid on, it's gonna get really soft and caramelized, and that's what I feel like doing right now. So then we can just think about what's gonna happen next, or put on a playlist, or phone a friend. You have a few minutes now. So for this personal pot of beans, I wanna see some caramelization. Turmeric has a little bit of a bitterness to it, and coaxing some sweetness out of the onion might be a nice check and balance. And this looks really good, super sizzly, floppy. My spices are toasting. I would like to put some anchovies into my personal pot of beans and greens. And when I think about adding the anchovies, it might bring up a memory for me. And the memory that it is going to bring up for me right now is about making a batch of pasta fagioli for someone who is a pescatarian. And I was worried about it not having enough flavor. So I really loaded up on anchovy and added more than I had ever done before. And it was a really great batch. So like a lot of that stuff happens because the cooking in my life is so meaningful that I will start to think about like why I do certain things that I do, why I like certain things that I do. Foods my mom made, you know, smells are so transportive. It might be a bubble bath for you, but for me it's like a hot olive oil caramelized garlic bath. So for the beans, any bean, it's really up to you. I am using these Calypso beans from a farm that were sent to me. They're lovely, they're delightful, and they have not been soaked. So this is something that you don't have to soak the bean. Usually I do. If you already knew yesterday that you were gonna be feeling a certain way today, and you wanted to just soak some beans, not even knowing what you were gonna do with them, the cook time is gonna go a little faster. That's really the only difference. So from the turmeric, the color in here is insane. It looks gorgeous. The beans are getting dyed orange. So then in that sizzling time, you might go root around in the freezer and pull out your parm rinds that you've been saving for a cloudy day, which I have done. Gonna drop one of those in there. If you don't have the parm rind, that's fine. A dried shiitake might be really great to use instead. I have also done things like put like the bone from a ham hock in there, or part of a pork chop that didn't get finished and has like some bone and some meat. So you're just like amping flavor at this stage. And then in the root around in to go get the parm, you might find some turkey stock that you put down there from the bone-in turkey breast. And then I made stock after that. This isn't even thawed. That's what's crazy. You could do whatever you want. This is not clinically correct, but when it's personal pot of beans and beans, you can do whatever the you want. I'm gonna do this. It's not right, but it is gonna melt. If you don't have a random container of stock, or even 2 cups of stock or 1 cup of stock, just use water. It's gonna be great. I'm gonna end up adding water to cover the beans anyway. But this is the shortcut defrost method. When you just put something frozen into a hot pot, it's going to melt. It's melting. Now that this is at a simmer and my turkey stock has melted, the only choices left are like assessing my liquid level and then deciding when I'm gonna put the greens into the pan. The beans are mostly covered because they're dry. They're gonna absorb more liquid than if they were soaked. So I'm just gonna add a little more water. I think you wanna make sure you're covered your beans by at least 2 inches. I know that the spices are flavoring this, but also making sure that there is enough salt in the cooking liquid because that's what's seasoning the beans. Oh, that was a good turkey stock. Delicious. I once interviewed Jeremy Fox, who is a chef based out on the West Coast, and he taught me how to make his chickpeas, which are in Where Cooking Begins, I think. And the quote he gave me was, if the broth tastes good, the beans will taste good. And that is something that has really stuck in my head and is one of those random little sentences that's gonna pop into my brain when I'm just making a personal pot of beans and greens in pajamas or a bathrobe or porky pigging it. You just don't know. So this bean is very hard. It's starting to shrivel. It's rock hard. Nothing is happening. Liquid tastes good. Parm rind is gonna melt. Alchemy and witchy cauldron stuff is gonna happen. I'm going to partially cover this and then go watercolor, go do your drawing, or do something mindless like Naked and Afraid. That's my new one. We love Naked and Afraid because it is so affirming of the life choices I have made. These people are naked and afraid. They're getting eaten alive by bugs, and it just makes me feel like I am doing something right. So go do that. And then come back and stir this every once in a while until you feel it's time to add the greens. And we'll get there together. Some amount of time later, depending on your bean, and depending on your simmer, and depending on whether you soaked, and depending on how covered your pot was, your beans are going to start to soften. I actually am looking for the greens to cook for a long time with this one. Sometimes I just want to add the greens and have them wilt and eat them more like fresh. But for this one, I'm going after that like long cooked flavor of the green. And I'm also looking for not just the long cooked flavor of the green and the way that it's going to change the broth, but also the texture of the green is going to become like you could just, it's like the fibers are just smushing apart and you could cut through it with your spoon. So that's a vibe, and that's my vibe right now. On a different day, my vibe could be more bright green and verdant, and your vibe could be something in between. Here's another vibe. This is escarole. You guys have seen me with kale like 8,000 different times. And I started to feel like I don't give escarole enough love. My sister loves escarole and always has it in the house. My mom cooked with escarole all the time. So it was kind of funny for us, like when kale and like leafy greens like that became like trendy in a culinary way, and we were like, I don't get it, because like either kale or escarole was in every batch of soup my mom ever made, I feel like. But any leafy green would be good here, including mature spinach, which also does not get enough airtime in my kitchen. Taste again. It's so good. The salt is great. So now it goes back to a simmer and it hangs out, and you do whatever. And it takes as long as it takes. And then at a certain point, you're gonna remember that you put a pot of beans and greens on, and you're gonna come back, and then you're gonna eat it. If you really wanna be nice to yourself, you will make Carole's fried bread to go with your delicious personal pot of beans and greens. So my mom, when she was making us something delicious or a soup, usually on Sundays, we always had soup, she would say, do you guys want fried bread with your soup? And no one ever said no. So if you have the thought to yourself, should I make myself some fried bread to go with my delicious personal pot of beans and greens? There's only one answer, and the answer is yes, of course you should. If you even had the thought of it, then you're just gonna think about how you should have done it if you don't do it. So you might as well just do it. Fried bread, ideally you would start with day-old bread, and then you just fry the bread in the olive oil. And it needs to be a lot of oil because we're not toasting the bread in the oil, we're frying the bread. So the finished texture ideally is going to be like shattery, crispy, brown, thin ice on the top, and then kind of warm and like chewy and delicious and steamy in the center. And if you use a very thin amount of oil, you'll just be toasting the surface, but nothing is really gonna happen into the inner sanctum of the bread. It's kind of like French toast, but just with olive oil. low and slow. Don't crank the heat. It will burn. And you just give it some time to get really gorgeous and golden. I would do this when I'm pretty certain that my personal pot of beans and greens is almost done. Final stages. Just putting a flourish on it. You deserve it. Bean check. Final bean check. These beans are gorgeous. Creamy. Falling apart. Now you have the option of blending a portion of the soup and putting it back in for added creaminess and lusciousness. I sometimes like a really brothy soup. Other people that I know and love like to have it partially blended and then put back. So maybe those people weren't with me on all of these nights that I spent half of my time solo bolo, but maybe I was thinking about those people that I love and how they prefer their personal pot of beans and greens. I just don't believe in this whole like comfort food means lying in bed with a bag of bonbons. I just think that that's like so not real and dated and like actually like quite hateful to women, particularly. The kind of comfort that I get from food is this kind of food. So that's like just enough so that when you put it back in, it's gonna fill in the brothy texture of the personal pot of beans and greens, and it's gonna give it more richness. When I make something like this, I'm comforting myself through the action and then also, very importantly, through the eating. So I'm gonna be vulnerable with you guys, and we're gonna eat the personal pot of beans and greens in like a Carla approved. Okay, here's the setup. Safety first, we have the kitchen towel down to protect. And I've got my tray and my situation and my toast and my spoon and my phone. And of course, the remote. Naked and afraid.
Okay, Carla, playing escapist content.
Shattering. The best part is nobody's coming for my bread, you know, because nobody else is here. It's actually really yummy. When you yourself are cooking for yourself and enjoying a quiet night with a delicious bowl of soup, it can be really nice. I'm not saying I want to be alone all the time, but sometimes it's real nice. Generally, like, well, and you're not going to ever come across a recipe that's going to say, like, add stock, frozen or thawed. Like, generally, we would like the liquids to be in a liquid form, but it's fine.
Every time I make soup, it looks
Yeah,
like that.
you just end up with an iceberg in the center.